on getting a copy of your speech just to compare yours and Deputy or Minister O'Donnell's. I think they're the same blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg famously said about how we deal with the climate crisis. Look, we're no strangers to having to use our private members' time to pursue bills that just sit and wait and get nothing done with them. The same happened to a climate emergency measure bill, which was passed by this Oireachtas, and then we had to use our private members' time to insist that it moved through committee. With the support of your party in opposition at the time, we got that passed as well, and then it was obstructed by a further use of some other vague standing order, which we ended up in the High Court contesting. So we're used to having to challenge this House on its implementation or lack of democracy, and we do so today in a huge level of sincerity. But I want to talk about the response of both yourself and Minister O'Donnell, but I do have a copy of his speech here, and I've just gone through it again. And I've noted 5 or 6 times he has used the question of the idea of balance between landlords and tenants as an argument for why you would not support this bill. Well, you have failed. You have utterly failed, and all political commentators make this point, to prove the correlation between the eviction ban and landlords exiting the market. You have not proved it. You say it, but you have not proved it. The Minister earlier talked about protecting landlords while trying to protecting renters while trying to keep small landlords. He talks about retaining small landlords while increasing housing stock, protecting renters while trying to keep small landlords in the system. The system can provide a feasible, viable, firm, safe, secure network for both landlords and tenants. Well, you have failed. If you didn't fail, we wouldn't be doing this today. If the housing figures weren't escalating because of the lifting of the eviction ban, we wouldn't be making this argument with you today. And the record of Fine Gael in government was alluded to earlier on by, I think it was Deputy O'Brien, and he's quite right. Again, I looked back on the record, and it stuck in my head. In 2016, as Minister for Housing, Simon Coveney promised to end homelessness. On the anniversary of the 1916 rise and the 100th anniversary, he made a big deal of it. And I quote what he said: "I would be crazy to promise a solution to the use of hotels and B&Bs for emergency accommodations for families by mid-2017, but I am going to make it happen." He even gave a comment to a media outlet that he bets his career on his promise to end homelessness. Now, my God, they'd say mass in this place. If they say anything, they'd say anything at all to try and prove themselves right. If he was an honest elected representative, he wouldn't be the Minister for the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. He'd have resigned, because he utterly failed to hold to a promise which he repeated in 2016. Instead of that, in 2016 we had 6,906 people homeless. That has more than doubled 7 years later. Now, if that's your record in government, and I really want to repeat this, and I've said it to you many times, shame on the Green Party for backing up the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael coalition in the implementation, particularly of the housing and homelessness that is the crisis in this country, and the main crisis that dominates people's lives. I want to comment on the reference to domestic and gender-based violence and refuge spaces here. Tonight we're going to be discussing the bill on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence agency that is to be set up. Well, we currently have 181 refuge spaces for people suffering from gender-based violence in relationships. Istanbul Convention, which we've signed up to, recommends 472. What a gap! And what is the promise? By the end of 2024, we'll have another 24 spaces. Many counties are without any spaces at all. And the truth is that many people continue to live with their abuser because they cannot go into homeless accommodation and put their children into hotels and B&Bs for years on end. I have many families who are 2-3 years in homeless accommodation. So I'll repeat, your speech, I'd like a copy of it, but it is more blah, 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 and the same blah, blah I heard from the Minister earlier on. It is shameful that the deputies who didn't turn up here today for the debate, they'll all turn up here tonight to vote the way they're told to vote, which is to oppose this motion, which would move an eviction ban to do what it's supposed to do, not to strike a balance between landlord and tenant, but to protect vulnerable families and particularly children from ending up in disgraceful conditions for years on end while there is a housing and homeless crisis that consecutive governments have failed to deal with.